Stone dust settles over the hills of North Carolina as a private home rises to a scale no American family will ever attempt again. The Biltmore Estate stands finished in 1895. A palace of stone and steel with hundreds of rooms, endless corridors, and a workforce large enough to resemble a small town. It is not built to generate profit or serve the public. It exists for one purpose: to display absolute wealth without restraint. Yet more than a century later, even the richest people alive refuse to build anything like it. This is not because modern billionaires lack money or ambition. It is because the rules of wealth have changed. Taxes, labor costs, land pressure, and inheritance laws quietly turned monuments into liabilities, and excess into risk. The story begins long before the mansion's towers pierced the skyline, before its halls echoed with footsteps, before its name became synonymous with excess. In the late 1890s, the hills of North Carolina were still largely rural, shaped by forests, small farms, and uneven roads that followed the land rather than controlled it. Into this landscape came a project so large that the environment itself had to be re-engineered. Trees were felled not in patches, but by the thousands. Hills were carved and reshaped. Entire sections of land were leveled so that stone could stand where soil had once been uneven and unstable. Roads were built not to connect communities, but to serve a single private ambition. Rail lines were extended specifically for this project. Trains carried stone, steel, timber, and glass into an area that had never supported such volume. They also carried people, skilled craftsmen, unskilled laborers, engineers, supervisors, and servants arrived in waves. Temporary housing appeared, supply chains formed. For years, the region functioned less like countryside and more like an industrial site, all in service of one structure that did not yet exist. This alone reveals something essential about wealth. At the end of the 19th century, no public authority questioned whether such a transformation of land was appropriate. There were no environmental reviews. There were no zoning restrictions strong enough to matter. Ownership granted near total control. If the money existed, the project moved forward. When construction began, scale was not an accident. It was the point. The house was designed to dominate its surroundings visually and psychologically. Thick stone walls rose slowly, carefully laid to suggest endurance rather than speed. The architecture deliberately borrowed from European aristocratic traditions, not because they were efficient, but because they carried an implication of lineage and permanence. These styles were chosen to suggest that this wealth, like old European dynasties, was meant to last for centuries. Inside, every decision rejected restraint. Rooms were not sized for comfort alone, but for impact. Ceilings stretched upward far beyond what daily life required. Corridors extended so long that movement through them felt ceremonial. Staircases were built wide and grand, forcing the body to slow down, to look upward, to acknowledge scale. Nothing was optimized. Everything was amplified. Even spaces never meant for guests reflected this philosophy. Service corridors were long and complex. Kitchens were vast, capable of producing meals for large gatherings at any moment. Storage rooms held food, linens, fuel, and supplies in quantities meant to sustain the household for extended periods without outside support. Wine cellars stretched deep underground. Mechanical systems were intricate and labor-intensive. This was not a house designed to rest. It was a machine that required constant operation. The mansion functioned as a self-contained world. It generated its own routines, its own economy, its own hierarchy. Food production extended into surrounding farmland owned and controlled by the estate. Water systems were engineered specifically for the house. Roads within the property served aesthetic goals as much as practical ones. The mansion did not fit into the landscape, it reshaped it. This kind of project was possible because wealth itself behaved differently in that era. At the end of the 19th century, fortunes were extraordinarily concentrated. Industrialization had created massive profits in railroads, steel, oil, and finance. Oversight was minimal, regulation was weak, markets rewarded scale and expansion. Once wealth entered private hands, it remained largely untouched by government. There was no federal income tax. There was no modern estate tax. There was little expectation that private wealth should circulate back into public systems. Ownership itself was considered justification. If a family had the means to build something, that was reason enough. Labor made this concentration of wealth practical. The workforce required to build and maintain such a mansion was enormous, yet affordable by the standards of the time. Many workers were immigrants or rural laborers with limited options. Wages were low. Labor protections were minimal. Domestic service was not viewed as temporary or undesirable. It was a stable profession that could last a lifetime and often passed from one generation to the next. Once the house opened, this labor did not disappear. It multiplied. Fires had to be lit before dawn in dozens of fireplaces. Ash had to be cleared. Fuel had to be carried. Rooms had to be cleaned daily regardless of use. Floors were polished by hand. Furniture required constant care. Laundry moved continuously through large facilities. Meals were prepared even when only the family was present. Gardens demanded attention in every season. Roads required repair. Equipment needed maintenance. Silence and comfort were not natural states. They were manufactured conditions, produced every hour by people who remained largely unseen. The scale of the house ensured that no single worker ever saw the whole system. Each role was narrow, repetitive, and essential. The household functioned less like a family home and more like a carefully managed operation at the time. This arrangement did not feel excessive within elite society. It matched expectations. Wealth was meant to be visible. Large households were signs of success. Hosting was not optional. It was a social obligation. To withdraw from this display risked losing status. Grandeur reinforced influence, and influence protected wealth. The surrounding land reinforced the illusion of permanence. Thousands of acres stretched outward from the mansion. Forests were managed to create scenic views. Farms were established to supply the household. Landscapes were reshaped for visual harmony rather than necessity. Water features were engineered. Gardens were designed to impress in every season. Everything suggested that this arrangement would endure indefinitely. When the mansion reached completion in 1895, it stood as the ultimate expression of American private wealth. Guests arrived by train and carriage. They entered spaces designed to overwhelm the senses. Light reflected off stone and carved wood. Sound softened by sheer volume. Silence felt deliberate, almost sacred. This was not simply a residence. It was a statement that private individuals could rival monarchs. Yet even at this moment of triumph, the mansion rested on assumptions that would not survive the coming century. It assumed that labor would remain cheap and plentiful. It assumed that government would remain distant from private fortunes. It assumed that land ownership carried no ongoing penalty beyond upkeep. It assumed that wealth could remain fixed in physical form without consequence. These assumptions shaped every architectural and operational decision. Grandeur mattered more than efficiency. Permanence mattered more than adaptability. Maintenance was treated as manageable because income appeared endless. Enormous value was locked into stone, land, and systems that produced no direct return. This was not seen as dangerous because the economic environment of the time rewarded stability. Businesses expanded steadily rather than rapidly. Markets moved slowly. Fortunes grew through long-term ownership. The future appeared predictable. Wealth felt solid, heavy, and secure. But beneath the surface, forces were already gathering. Cities were expanding rapidly. Workers were organizing and demanding rights. Governments were growing in size and responsibility. Public infrastructure required funding. Education systems expanded. Sanitation improved. Transportation networks grew. All of this demanded reliable revenue. The idea that extreme private wealth should contribute more actively to society began to gain political and moral weight. At first, this shift was subtle. It appeared in debates, editorials, and reform movements. It did not yet threaten the mansion directly, but it marked a fundamental change in how wealth would be viewed. The mansion existed apart from these pressures, protected by distance, tradition, and social status. For a time, it seemed immune. Its owners could afford the costs. Its operations ran smoothly. Its presence inspired admiration rather than criticism. Yet the very features that made it impressive also made it vulnerable. Size demanded endless maintenance. Complexity required constant oversight. Heating systems consumed vast amounts of fuel. Repairs never truly ended. Stone cracked with temperature changes. Roofs aged. Wood warped. Gardens demanded seasonal labor without pause. None of this produced income. The mansion consumed wealth continuously without replenishing it. As long as outside revenue flowed freely, this imbalance remained hidden. But the structure itself could not adapt. It could not shrink. It could not move. It could not easily change purpose. The house also existed outside productive economic systems. Factories earned money, railroads charged fees, financial institutions generated returns. The mansion did none of this. It was a consumer of wealth, not a generator. This distinction would become critical once external pressures appeared. For now, the illusion of permanence held. The house stood complete, fully staffed, fully maintained, and socially admired. It represented the absolute peak of an era when private wealth believed scale alone could overcome limits. This moment matters because it explains everything that follows. The mansion was not built recklessly. It was built logically within the rules of its time. Those rules allowed extreme concentration of resources without penalty. They rewarded visibility, control, and permanence. But rules change. Systems evolve. What once made sense becomes weakness when conditions shift. The world outside the gates was accelerating. Laws were evolving. Expectations were changing. The foundation beneath private monuments was already beginning to weaken. Stone does not sense these shifts. It does not anticipate change. It only stands until pressure becomes too great. When everything still appears to work. When costs are high but manageable. When wealth still believes it can stand still. From this height, the story moves forward toward the slow realization that even the greatest fortunes cannot escape time, cost, and transformation. At the center of that realization stands the Biltmore Estate, not yet a warning and not yet a museum, but a living symbol of a world that believed permanence could be purchased. When the mansion was officially completed, there was a sense of relief among those involved in its creation. Years of planning, construction, transport, and coordination had finally come to an end. The walls were solid. The roofs no longer leaked. The interiors were furnished and polished. Guests arrived, admired, and departed in awe. From the outside, the house looked finished, stable, and permanent. Yet this moment of completion marked the beginning of a far more demanding chapter. Building the mansion had been difficult, but maintaining it would prove far more exhausting, far more expensive, and far more unforgiving. A house of such scale could never rest. It demanded activity every hour of every day, long before sunrise. Staff moved quietly through service corridors to prepare the building for another day of use. Fires were lit in dozens of fireplaces to fight the cold held inside thick stone walls. Stone did not respond quickly to heat. Once cold settled into it, warmth had to be forced in slowly and constantly. Fuel was carried by hand. Ash had to be removed again and again. Chimneys required regular cleaning to prevent dangerous buildup. One missed task could affect entire sections of the house. Temperature control alone consumed enormous effort. In winter, cold seeped into walls, floors, and ceilings. In summer, heat collected in upper levels. Ventilation relied on human action rather than automated systems. Windows had to be opened and closed at precise times. Curtains were adjusted to manage sunlight. Air moved slowly through such a large structure, and comfort depended on constant attention. There was no simple switch to control the climate. Comfort was produced manually, room by room. Cleaning operations never stopped. Dust gathered endlessly in rooms that were rarely entered. Long corridors collected dirt carried by shoes and air currents. Floors stretched so wide that cleaning them required teams working in shifts. Stone floors needed careful treatment to avoid damage. Wood floors had to be polished by hand. Carpets were beaten and brushed repeatedly. Tall windows were difficult to reach and required ladders or scaffolding. Heavy curtains were taken down, cleaned, and rehung on a schedule that never truly ended. Furniture demanded constant care. Many pieces were imported, delicate and irreplaceable. Wood dried and cracked if humidity changed. Fabric faded or tore if mishandled. Small mistakes carried large consequences. Even doors required attention. Hinges loosened. Wood swelled or shrank with temperature changes. Every sound was noticed. Silence, which guests associated with luxury, was carefully constructed through maintenance. Laundry was a world of its own. Thousands of linens passed through washing areas regularly. Bed sheets, tablecloths, napkins, towels, uniforms, and curtains all required cleaning. Water had to be heated in large quantities. Soap was prepared in bulk. Early washing machines required supervision. Drying took time and space. Items were pressed carefully to maintain appearance. Storage required protection from moisture, insects, and dust. Laundry work alone employed many people and consumed significant resources. Food preparation was equally complex. The kitchen did not serve a single family. It supported an entire operation. Ingredients arrived in large deliveries. Meat was stored in cold rooms. Vegetables came from estate farms or nearby suppliers. Bread was baked daily. Multiple meals were prepared regardless of how many people were present. The system could not easily scale down. It was built for abundance, not efficiency. Waste management was another hidden burden. Large volumes of food scraps, ash, and other refuse had to be removed quietly and regularly. Storage of waste was limited to avoid odor and pests. Disposal required coordination and labor. Nothing about daily life was simple. Luxury depended on logistics. The staff required to support this system formed a rigid hierarchy. At the top were managers and supervisors who coordinated operations. Below them were skilled workers who handled cooking, cleaning, maintenance, and groundskeeping. Beneath them were assistants and laborers who performed repetitive tasks. Every role depended on others. If one group fell behind, the entire system suffered. This workforce was large, but it was never stable. People aged, people became ill, people left for better opportunities. New workers had to be recruited constantly. Training was slow and costly. The mansion was not an easy place to learn. Mistakes could damage valuable materials. Inexperience increased risk. Loyalty helped, but it could not eliminate turnover. The grounds multiplied every challenge. Thousands of acres required constant care. Roads cracked and eroded after storms. Bridges needed inspection. Fences broke. Trees fell and blocked paths. Water systems clogged with debris. Gardens demanded seasonal labor without pause. In spring, planting began. In summer, trimming and watering dominated. In autumn, leaves had to be cleared. In winter, snow and ice created new problems. Land ownership was not passive. It demanded daily effort. At first, these costs were absorbed without concern. The fortune behind the mansion was immense. The owners had planned for a large household. Detailed budgets were prepared. Managers tracked expenses carefully. The system worked, but only because external income continued to flow steadily. The deeper problem was scale. Every small issue became large. A minor repair in a normal home became a major project here. A single leaking roof section required scaffolding, skilled labor, and specialized materials. A heating problem in one wing affected dozens of rooms. There were no cheap solutions. Everything cost more because everything was bigger. Modernization offered limited relief. Early electrical systems reduced some labor, but installing them in thick stone walls was difficult and expensive. Plumbing upgrades required invasive work. Heating improvements demanded redesign of entire systems. Each improvement cost far more than it would have in a smaller home. The building resisted change. Seasonal use created another burden. Large parts of the house were unoccupied for months, yet they still required care. Empty rooms still needed heating to prevent moisture damage. Closed wings still needed inspection. Shutting systems down completely risked long-term harm. The mansion could not simply be turned off. Social expectations added pressure. A mansion demanded guests. Hosting was not optional. Large dinners, seasonal events, and extended visits were expected as proof of status. These events required extra staff, more food, increased lighting, and extensive preparation. Hosting reinforced social position, but it also accelerated wear and cost. Declining to host risked social isolation. As years passed, the world outside the gates began to change. Wages slowly increased. Industrial jobs attracted workers to cities. Domestic service became less desirable. Finding and keeping staff grew harder. Turnover increased. Experience declined. Training costs rose. The smooth operation of the house became more fragile. Expenses rose unevenly. Fuel prices fluctuated. Skilled labor demanded higher pay. Materials became more expensive. The mansion did not generate income to offset these increases. It relied entirely on outside wealth. The balance that once felt comfortable began to tighten. The psychological burden grew alongside financial strain. Decisions once made casually became serious debates. Should certain rooms remain open? Should repairs be delayed? Should staff numbers be reduced? Each choice saved money in the short term, but risked long-term damage. Preservation became a constant negotiation between cost and consequence. Importantly, this was not yet a collapse. Life remained luxurious. The house still functioned. Guests still admired it, but the margin for error shrank year by year. Wealth that once felt endless now required careful planning and constant defense. This revealed a deeper truth. The mansion had been designed for display, not efficiency. Its beauty came from excess. That excess carried a cost that never stopped increasing. The house demanded money not just once, but forever. Unlike businesses or investments, the mansion could not adapt to market conditions. It could not downsize easily. It could not relocate. It could not pause operations without damage. It was fixed in place, fixed in purpose, and fixed in cost. As time moved forward, these pressures became impossible to ignore. The mansion remained impressive, but it was no longer carefree. It had become a structure that consumed wealth steadily, and without mercy. The kingdom still stood in stone, but it demanded tribute every single day. Maintenance alone began to test even the greatest fortunes. For decades, the owners of great estates lived inside a kind of financial weather that rarely changed. They planned around staff wages, repairs, and the cost of hosting, but they did not plan around government, taking a serious share of their income. The state felt far away, small, and limited. Wealth, once earned, felt like something that could be held in place. That sense of safety came from how public money was raised during the 19th century. Government relied heavily on tariffs, local property taxes, and indirect fees. Many public responsibilities were smaller than they would become later. The federal government did not yet run the kind of large national systems that demand steady, massive revenue year after year. In that world, a private palace made sense. The money that built it could move from business profits into stone and land with little interference. The estate could then sit quietly, protected by distance, tradition, and social status. Even when costs were high, the system felt stable enough that a family could believe it would remain that way. But the country changed faster than those houses did. As the 20th century arrived, the United States became more urban, more industrial, and more crowded. Cities grew rapidly, sometimes faster than clean water. Sewage systems, schools, and roads could handle. The public began demanding solutions that required money on a new scale. Tariffs and old local taxes could not carry that burden alone. Tariffs rose and fell with trade and politics. Local property taxes were uneven and often politically difficult. Meanwhile, the needs kept expanding. The state began searching for a revenue stream that could grow with the economy and reach those most able to pay. This is where the story turns from household management to national pressure. It is not that the rich suddenly became less rich. In many cases, they became richer. The problem was that their wealth was now being noticed as a potential funding source. And once governments see a source of money, they tend to build systems designed to access it. Politics also shifted in a way that mattered for estates. Reform movements argued that extreme concentrations of wealth were not simply personal success. They claimed that wealth depended on public order, public infrastructure, and the labor of millions. If the public helped make wealth possible, the public could claim a share of it. That argument became stronger as inequality became easier to see. Newspapers, magazines, and later radio and film spread stories quickly. The public could compare the scale of private living with the conditions of industrial workers. The mansion was no longer a distant rumor. It was an image that could travel. Against that background, federal income taxation emerged as a fundamental change. At first, wealthy families often treated it like an irritation rather than a threat. The earliest impact could feel modest compared with the size of their fortunes. But the deeper change was about visibility and control, not only about the initial rate. Once income had to be reported, wealth lost a layer of privacy that had protected it for generations. Earnings were no longer just numbers inside private ledgers. They became figures placed into official records. That meant the government could measure wealth consistently, year after year, and adjust policy based on what it found. This altered behavior even when the total amount paid seemed tolerable. Families began to spend more time proving what they earned and where it came from. They began to plan around tax calendars. They began to treat certain choices as risky, not because they were bad investments, but because they increased taxable exposure. Over time, income taxation became a normal feature of life rather than a rare event. Rates could rise, rules could tighten. A household that once assumed it could expand without public interference now had to consider a permanent annual claim on its cash flow. That claim reduced the amount available for the mansion, its staff, and its constant repairs. The key point is compounding. Wealth grows fastest when it remains untouched. When a yearly share is removed, growth slows. That change can feel small in the short term, but over decades it reshapes what a family can afford. A mansion built in an era of lightly taxed growth was now being supported in an era of taxed, measured income. Then came the deeper shock. Estate taxation. Income tax affects the living. Estate tax strikes at the moment when property changes hands. The moment when a family is often least able to respond quickly. This is where the mansion system became fragile, because large estates were rich in assets but poor in liquidity. A great house could be worth a fortune on paper, but it did not produce cash like a factory or a railroad. It consumed cash. Its value was locked into stone, wood, land, and prestige. When the owner died and taxes came due, the family could not simply pay with the building's beauty. They needed liquid money. If there was plenty of liquid wealth elsewhere, the problem could be solved, at least once. But many fortunes were tied up in business holdings, land, and long-term investments. Turning those into cash quickly could be costly. Selling under pressure often meant accepting a lower price or losing control of important assets. This created a new kind of forced decision. Keep the mansion and sell something productive, or keep the productive asset and sacrifice the estate. Sometimes the choice was not direct, but the tension was always there. The mansion began to compete with the rest of the fortune for survival. Even when families paid the tax without selling the house, the structure of the future changed. Each transfer to a new generation carved away at the cushion that had once made the mansion feel safe. The house remained the same size, and its maintenance costs remained brutal. But the supporting fortune became smaller. This is how the mansion becomes a trap. It does not shrink when wealth shrinks. It remains fixed, demanding the same staff levels, the same heating, the same repairs. A family can cut corners for a while, but the building punishes neglect. Deferred maintenance becomes more expensive later. Small problems become large ones. Estate taxation also changes how people think about legacy. In the 19th century, Building a permanent estate could feel like a gift to future generations. In the 20th century, that same estate could feel like a burden handed down with a bill attached. Instead of inheritance being pure gain, it became a complex financial event. Tax policy, over time, pushed wealthy families toward productive assets and away from symbolic ones. A business can generate revenue, shares can be sold, investments can be shifted. A mansion cannot do these things easily. It is an expensive object that sits in one place, easy to value, and hard to defend. This is where visibility becomes dangerous. A giant house is easy for assessors and newspapers to identify. Its value can be estimated. Its land can be measured. It is a clear target for public arguments about fairness. A portfolio is quiet and abstract. A mansion is concrete and loud. Public mood mattered. In periods of economic hardship, anger often looks for symbols. A large private estate becomes a symbol that does not require explanation. It looks like excess. It looks like insulation from reality. Even if the owners were charitable or responsible, the image could still provoke resentment. That resentment translated into political support for stronger taxation. Politicians learned that arguing for taxes on wealth was easier when the public could picture what they were taxing. A mansion, with its towers and endless rooms, provided that picture. It helped transform policy from theory into a story people could feel. War magnified all of this. Large-scale conflict demanded enormous public spending for armies, factories, and logistics. Governments expanded taxation to meet those needs, even if some measures began as temporary wartime tools. The habit of higher taxation often remained afterward, because public systems did not shrink back to their old size. This meant wealth faced not one new law but a new era. A modern state required regular revenue, and the easiest place to find it was among those with the most resources. The mansion world had been built under an older state that did not have the machinery or the ambition to do that. As taxes rose and rules tightened, wealthy families adapted, but adaptation had costs. They hired lawyers and accountants. They created trusts. They shifted ownership structures. They tried to reduce exposure. These strategies could help, but they also introduced complexity, oversight, and risk. Complexity also changes behavior inside a family. When wealth is simple, decisions can be personal. When wealth is wrapped in structures designed to manage tax and inheritance, decisions become institutional. The family begins to operate like a corporation, with meetings, advisors, and long documents that define what can be done. This reduces the emotional freedom that once supported grand gestures like building a private palace. The mansion is no longer just a home. It becomes a line item, an exposure point, an asset that can trigger obligations. When that mindset takes hold, the romance of building the biggest private home in the country begins to fade. There is also a psychological shift in how risk is perceived. A mansion is a fixed, visible asset in a world where policy can change quickly. If a new tax rule appears, the house cannot move. If assessments rise, the house cannot hide. If public anger targets excess, the house becomes an easy example. Land was sold to reduce taxable value and reduce the cost of managing huge acreage. Wings were closed, staff was reduced, repairs were delayed, items were sold quietly. Sometimes art, sometimes furniture, sometimes land that had once been part of the original vision. The decline of the great mansions rarely began with a single dramatic moment. It began with quiet math, repeated over and over. A new repair quote arrived and looked higher than the last one. A tax assessment crept upward. A key employee left and was not replaced quickly. Nothing looked like disaster at first, but the mansion started to run on small compromises that kept piling up. From the outside, these houses still looked unshaken. Stone does not show anxiety. Towers stand tall whether the accounts are healthy or not. A passerby might see the same grand silhouette and assume the old world still lived inside. But behind the walls, the mansion began to shrink in daily life, even if its footprint stayed the same. The first change was often simple: heat and light. Heating a huge stone structure is not like warming a normal house. The building absorbs cold and holds it. Families began to heat only the rooms they used, and only during the hours they needed them. Lights went off in hallways that were once always bright. Lamps stayed unlit in guest rooms that were no longer used. That strategy saved money. But the building did not like it. Unheated rooms invite moisture. Moisture creeps into wood, plaster, and fabric. Mold begins where no one looks. Behind cabinets, inside closets, along the edges of walls. Paint blisters. Wallpaper loosens. Floors warp. A mansion was designed to be constantly cared for, and partial shutdown created new damage that later demanded expensive repairs. Then came staffing. In the old era, a large estate depended on a large human system. Cooks, cleaners, gardeners, drivers, and maintenance workers formed a living network that kept problems small. As costs rose, families reduced staff. At first it looked like efficiency, a smaller crew doing the same work. Over time it became a weakness. Without enough eyes and hands, minor issues stop being caught early. A loose roof tile becomes a leak. A leak becomes stained plaster. Stained plaster becomes rot in hidden beams. Rot becomes structural repair. The cost curve changes fast. Mansions punish delay because they have so many points of failure. Every roof section, every gutter, every window, every pipe becomes a place where time can enter and begin its slow damage. Labor markets were also changing. Domestic service became harder to sustain as cities and factories offered different paths. Higher wages and more independence pulled workers away from estate life. Skilled craftsmen became more expensive and less available. The mansion needed specialists, but specialists had more options. Every repair took longer to schedule and cost more to complete. The pressure did not stay inside the house. It spread across the land. Many of these estates owned thousands of acres, which once meant privacy and power. Now those acres meant taxes, insurance, road upkeep, fence repairs, forestry management, and storm cleanup. Land ownership became an ongoing expense rather than a passive symbol. Each acre created responsibility that did not generate income. So land became the first thing to be cut. Families sold parcels at the edge of the estate, then larger sections as pressure increased. Forests were separated, farms were sold, boundaries moved inward, cash came in. Taxes dropped. Management became simpler. On paper, this looked like a smart move, but it changed the identity of the estate. A great mansion was designed to sit at the center of a private world. When that world shrank, the house felt exposed. Roads that once belonged to the estate became public roads. New neighbors appeared, development crept closer, the mansion became more visible, and visibility brought attention. Attention raised risks. Political, social, and financial. The estate lost the isolation that had once protected its lifestyle. As finances tightened further, families faced a problem that surprised many of them. These mansions were hard to sell. The buyer pool was far smaller than the building suggested. A mansion built for a household of servants and constant hosting did not match modern life. Even wealthy buyers hesitated, because the true cost was not the purchase price. It was the decades of operation afterward. Modern rich buyers could get luxury in forms that demanded less sacrifice. They could buy a large modern home with efficient systems. They could buy multiple properties rather than one massive burden. They could buy privacy without owning thousands of acres. A giant estate from the old era came with a reputation for endless maintenance, high taxes, and complex staffing. It looked like a problem, not a prize. Even when a buyer was interested, the offer often came with conditions. Discounts were demanded, repairs were requested. The seller was expected to absorb costs just to make the property usable. Deals fell apart easily because the future expenses were too uncertain. Insurance, heating, structural upkeep, and compliance with modern codes could explode without warning. This created a trap. The family could not easily keep the mansion, but they could not easily sell it either. They could reduce staff and close rooms. But that increased decay and lowered the property's appeal. The longer the house sat in limbo, the worse it became. Decay lowered value. Lower value made selling harder, and harder selling pushed owners to delay repairs even more. Many owners tried to escape the trap through reinvention. A mansion could become a school, a seminary, a hospital, a corporate headquarters, or a hotel. This path made sense in theory. It created revenue. It brought constant activity back into the building. It offered a reason to maintain it. But conversion was expensive, and the building fought the process at every step. A private mansion was not built for public crowds. Fire codes demanded new exits, alarms, and safety systems. Electrical wiring had to be modernized. Plumbing had to support large daily use. Accessibility requirements demanded ramps or lifts and redesigned pathways. Kitchens designed for private service often had to be rebuilt for commercial standards. Every upgrade required permits, engineering, and long periods of disruption. Even after renovation, the core problem remained. Scale does not disappear. The roof area is still enormous. The window count is still high. The heating volume is still vast. A new purpose might use only part of the building, but unused parts still age. A school might fill a few halls, yet the empty wings still demand inspection. A hotel might rent rooms, yet the income might not cover the full long-term burden of preserving a massive historic structure. Another path was more common and more symbolic. Mansions open to the public. Tours, events, and exhibitions turned private wealth into a public experience. Visitors paid admission. Gift shops and seasonal displays created additional income. Weddings and gatherings provided revenue streams that private family budgets could no longer match. This shift changed the mansion's meaning. A house built to separate the elite from society now depended on society to survive. Private rooms became exhibit space. Family identity became a public story told by guides and plaques. What had been personal life turned into shared history. For some owners, this felt like losing control. For others, it was the only way to prevent the building from collapsing. Public access also brought political protection. A mansion that became a heritage site could be reframed as culture rather than excess. It became easier to defend in public debate. Local communities could take pride in it. Donations could appear. Partnerships could form. A private monument became a public asset. And public assets are treated differently than private luxuries. But the public model was not a guaranteed rescue. Tourism is fragile. It depends on location, transportation, marketing, and economic cycles. A remote estate might struggle to attract enough visitors. A bad season could delay repairs. Delayed repairs could create new damage. The building's needs did not pause just because the ticket office had a slow month. When reinvention failed, abandonment followed. The moment a mansion became empty, time began to move faster. Without daily staff, small leaks went unnoticed. Water entered slowly and spread. Winter freezes cracked pipes. Summer heat dried wood and weakened joints. Animals found openings and built nests. Mold established itself in dark corners. Once a house falls into this state, restoration becomes vastly more expensive. Abandoned mansions also attracted human danger. Vandals broke windows and doors. Thieves stole metal fixtures and wiring. Floors were damaged by careless entry. Fire became a constant threat. Accidental or deliberate, each incident pushed the building closer to a tipping point where restoration no longer made financial sense. At that stage, demolition often became the most practical decision. Demolition is not only about clearing land. It is a financial calculation. An empty mansion still triggers property taxes. It still creates liability if someone is injured on the property. Security costs money. Insurance costs money. Removing the structure reduces ongoing risk and expense. A family might hate the idea, but mouth does not care about sentiment. Demolition also reflected a broader cultural change. In the peak mansion era, destroying such a house would have seemed unthinkable. These were supposed to be permanent. But permanence is a story people tell themselves when the system supports it. When the system changes, the story changes. A mansion becomes just another costly object that no longer fits the world around it. As more mansions declined, the effect spread. Buyers became more cautious. Communities saw the risk of abandoned estates. Local governments faced the burden of neglected landmarks. The market for giant private houses shrank further. This created a wave where multiple estates in a region could decline together, not because each family failed in isolation, but because the model itself was collapsing. The collapse of the old mansion model did not make the rich less ambitious. It made them more strategic. The lesson was not that luxury was wrong, or that wealth should stop expressing itself. The lesson was that a single, massive, fixed monument creates too many weak points. It attracts taxes, attention, regulation, and long-term cost. It is hard to sell, hard to hide, and impossible to move. Modern billionaires learned this lesson not from theory, but from watching what happened to the estates of the previous era. By the late 20th century and into the 21st, the biggest fortunes in the world were often larger than those of the Gilded Age, even when measured against inflation. Yet their owners rarely tried to build one private palace meant to last forever. Instead, they built a different system of luxury. It was less about stone and more about flexibility. Less about a single location and more about a network. Less about being admired and more about being protected. One of the clearest shifts was diversification of living space. The old model concentrated life in one center. One estate. One massive home that had to function every day. The new model spreads life across multiple properties, a penthouse in a financial city, a coastal retreat for certain seasons, a countryside home for privacy, a mountain property for winter, and sometimes several more across different countries. No single home becomes the full identity of the family. This strategy changes everything about cost and risk. If one property becomes inconvenient, it can be sold. If a region changes politically, the owner can shift time elsewhere. If taxes rise in one place, the owner can spend less time there. The wealth is not locked into one structure that must always be maintained at full capacity. Each property can be used selectively, and many costs can be reduced when it is empty. Modern technology makes this possible, unlike old mansions, which demanded constant staff. Modern luxury homes can be stabilized with automation. Climate systems maintain safe temperature and humidity without large teams. Security systems operate continuously with sensors, cameras, and remote monitoring. Lighting, water, and power can be controlled from anywhere. A house can sit empty for months and still remain in good condition, something a 19th century palace could never achieve. This reduces one of the greatest burdens of the old era. Permanent labor. Staff still exist in modern luxury, but their structure is different. Many services are outsourced. Cleaning crews arrive on schedule and leave. Maintenance teams handle systems in periodic visits. Landscaping can be managed by professional companies. Security can be contracted. The billionaire no longer needs a self-contained village of servants living on site year-round. This is not simply a cultural change. It is an economic strategy. Permanent staff create long-term obligations. Payroll, housing, benefits, and management complexity. Outsourcing turns fixed cost into variable cost. It makes luxury easier to scale up and down. It protects wealth from becoming trapped in a machine that never stops consuming resources. Ownership structures also evolved. Many properties are held through companies, trusts, or layered legal entities. This has several effects. It reduces personal exposure. It can offer privacy by separating a public name from a public property record. It can also create flexibility for sale, transfer, or restructuring. A mansion owned directly by a family is a direct target. A property held through complex ownership is less visible and often easier to manage strategically. This does not mean modern billionaires avoid taxes entirely. It means they plan around them with sophistication. They understand that law changes. They understand that political mood shifts. They understand that public scrutiny can arrive suddenly. The goal is not to pretend the state cannot reach them. The goal is to avoid placing all vulnerability in one obvious structure. The modern billionaire home is therefore not designed as a monument. It is designed as an asset. Even when it is beautiful, its beauty is paired with resale logic. The architecture tends to be more adaptable. Layouts are modern and flexible. Materials are chosen not only for prestige but for maintenance. Systems are designed for efficiency. Luxury exists, but it is engineered to avoid becoming a permanent burden. This is why modern homes, even extremely expensive ones, often feel different from old palaces. They are built for control rather than spectacle. They have fewer unused rooms. They rely more on central systems. They aim for privacy, not public art. The old mansion wanted guests to feel small. The modern luxury home often wants the outside world to stay away. Privacy has become a core value of modern wealth. In the Gilded Age, social status depended on visibility. Hosting, parties, and open display reinforced power. Today, visibility can be dangerous. Media coverage can turn a home into a symbol of inequality. Political debate can target conspicuous excess. Even personal security can be threatened by publicity. So modern billionaires often choose homes that are hidden rather than grand. This can mean remote locations, gated compounds, private roads, and limited sightlines. It can also mean buying neighboring parcels to create buffer zones, not for display, but for isolation. In this sense, modern billionaires still value land, but they value it for privacy and control rather than for symbolic dominance. Mobility is another defining feature of modern luxury. The old mansion model anchored wealth to one place. Modern wealth treats movement as protection. Private jets are part of this system. They allow the owner to live across multiple regions without losing time or comfort. They reduce dependence on public infrastructure and public schedules. They turn geography into a choice rather than a constraint. Yachts take this principle even further. A large yacht is, in many ways, a floating mansion. It offers luxury, staff, and privacy. Yet it avoids the main weakness of the old mansion. It is not fixed. It can move between jurisdictions. It can leave when a tension becomes uncomfortable. It can relocate based on weather, law, or personal preference. Mobility acts like a shield. This does not mean yachts are simple or cheap. They are extremely expensive. They require crews, maintenance, fuel, and complex logistics. But they offer one critical advantage. They can be sold more easily than a giant historic mansion. And they can move away from trouble. They are luxury with an exit route. The same logic applies to modern asset choices. Wealth today is often held in forms that can be shifted quickly. Stocks, funds, private equity, and other instruments can be rebalanced. Even high-end art, while not liquid like cash, is portable compared with land and stone. It can be stored in secure facilities, moved between locations, and sold through global markets. In the old mansion era, art was often displayed as decoration. In the modern era, art can function as both status and strategic asset. Philanthropy also became part of the modern playbook. In the mansion era, wealth was displayed physically. Today, wealth is often displayed through influence and public narrative. Donations and foundations create social legitimacy. They can reduce criticism. They can shape public perception. They also offer legal and financial structures that interact with taxation in ways that support long-term planning. This shift matters because it changes the relationship between wealth and society. In the old era, the mansion separated the elite from the public. In the modern era, many wealthy individuals prefer to appear connected to the public through visible giving, partnerships, and public-facing projects. This does not mean their luxury disappears. It means their public story becomes more carefully managed. Media and technology shape this behavior. The internet and constant news cycles can make a single image travel globally in hours. A giant mansion can become a viral symbol overnight. It can trigger anger, satire, or political attention. Modern billionaires understand this risk and often avoid building anything that can easily become a single defining image. Instead, their luxury becomes distributed and less legible. A person may have multiple homes, but no single property stands out as the ultimate symbol. The wealth is real, but is harder to summarize visually in the way Biltmore can be summarized. This reduces the chance of becoming the face of excess. The mansion still stands, but it no longer stands for what it was built to prove. It rises above the trees with the same towers, the same stone walls, the same grand silhouette meant to look eternal, yet the world that produced it has vanished. Today, the building survives not because private wealth kept it alive, but because its meaning changed. The mansion became a public artifact, a managed institution, a controlled experience. Its survival is a lesson, not a continuation. In its original era, the mansion was meant to be a private kingdom. It was designed to answer a bold question with architecture. How far could money go if nothing stopped it? The answer was scale, hundreds of rooms, vast land, armies of staff, a self-contained world that suggested the owners had escaped ordinary limits. The house did not simply provide comfort, it provided a narrative of permanence. That narrative depended on conditions that could not last. It depended on a social order where visible hierarchy was accepted, even celebrated. It depended on labor markets where staff were abundant and affordable. It depended on government systems that were smaller and less able to claim a portion of private wealth. It depended on a culture that treated private excess as admirable rather than provocative. As the 20th century unfolded, those conditions shifted one by one. Wages rose. Domestic service became less common. Regulations expanded. The state learned to tax income, inheritance, and property more effectively. Public opinion became more sensitive to inequality. The mansion, once a symbol of power, became a visible target for criticism. Every change tightened the pressure. At first, this pressure did not destroy the mansion. It simply narrowed the choices around it. Owners tried to preserve the old lifestyle by reducing costs. They closed rooms, they reduced staff, they delayed repairs, they sold land. Each step bought time but also weakened the building and its identity. The house remained large, but the private world around it shrank. Eventually, many owners of great estates faced a stark question. If the mansion could not survive as a private home, could it survive at all? In many cases, the only answer was transformation. The house had to stop being private and become something else. This is the moment when the monument era truly ends. A private monument becomes an institution. The owner becomes a manager rather than a monarch. The household becomes a business with revenue, costs, schedules, and marketing. The mansion's survival is no longer supported by a personal fortune alone. It is supported by public participation. Public tours are one of the most visible parts of this shift. When a mansion opens its doors to visitors, it reverses its original purpose. It was built to separate the elite from society, to create distance. Now it depends on society to live. The public pays to enter. The public funds preservation through tickets, events, and purchases. The house becomes an experience sold in controlled pieces. This changes the interior in subtle ways. Paths are defined for visitors. Some rooms are kept as displays, not living spaces. Furniture becomes an exhibit rather than a tool. Kitchens become educational, showing how the system once worked. Service corridors become part of the story. The mansion's private machinery becomes visible, because visibility now creates value. In the old era, staff were invisible so the owners could appear effortless. In the new era, staff become part of the narrative, because the public wants to understand how such a place functioned. The mansion becomes a lesson in logistics. It reveals how many people, how much work, and how much hidden cost were required to create luxury. Financially, the public model changes the equation, but does not erase the burden. Preservation is expensive, roofs still age, stone still cracks, mechanical systems still require upgrades, insurance and safety standards still apply. The difference is that the mansion can now generate income, and that income can be combined with donations, memberships, grants, and partnerships. But even this model has limits. Tourism depends on economic cycles. A downturn can reduce visitors. A natural disaster can disrupt operations. A slow season can delay maintenance. Delayed maintenance can create larger repairs later. Preservation remains a constant fight against time. The mansion can earn, but it cannot fully escape its needs. This is why surviving mansions often become managed like serious institutions. They employ historians, conservators, engineers, accountants, and marketers. They schedule renovations years in advance. They plan seasonal events to stabilize revenue. They develop branding that frames the estate as culture and heritage rather than private excess. They become part of a regional economy rather than a single family's identity. In this transformation, the mansion's meaning shifts again. It becomes a symbol not of private power, but of a historical era. Visitors do not come to admire a living aristocracy. They come to watch the ghost of one. They walk through rooms that are clean and lit, yet still feel distant, because the life that once animated them is gone. This is the key irony. The mansion survives by becoming less alive. A private home is messy, flexible, personal. A museum is controlled, preserved, staged. When a mansion becomes public, it gains protection but loses intimacy. It becomes a frozen moment, maintained like a specimen. The end of the monument era is also visible in what people build now. Modern billionaires do not build one great palace, because they do not want to be trapped inside a single object. They have learned that fixed grandeur can become a liability. They choose luxury that can be adjusted, sold, moved, or hidden. They build networks of comfort, not cathedrals of permanence. This difference reflects not only financial strategy but cultural change. In a world of constant media, a massive private palace can become a headline, a target, or a symbol of inequality. The richest people alive often work to avoid being reduced to a single image. A mansion like Biltmore is a perfect single image, which is exactly why it no longer fits the modern logic of wealth. It also reflects the changing nature of time and work. Old wealth often centered around land, industry, and long periods of stability. Modern wealth often centers around technology, finance, and rapid movement. The modern billionaire may live across continents in a single month. They may need to be near airports, business hubs, and secure private facilities. A single fixed estate does not match that rhythm. Yet the mansion still matters, because it preserves the memory of what private wealth once wanted to be. It shows a moment when money sought to become permanent through stone. It shows a moment when the elite believed they could build their own world and hold it against time. The mansion is the physical record of that belief. Walking through such a place today, you can feel the mismatch between the building and the modern world. The rooms are too large for ordinary life. The halls are too long. The infrastructure is too heavy. Everything is designed for a scale of staffing and expense that feels alien now. Visitors may admire the craft, but they also sense the cost behind it. This is why the mansion becomes a lesson in hidden systems. It teaches that luxury is not a surface. It is a structure of labor, logistics, and constant spending. The Grand Hall is not only stone and wood, it is heat, cleaning, staffing, repair, insurance, and management. It is an economic machine that needs fuel. In the 19th century, the fuel was a lightly taxed fortune and abundant labor. In the modern world, that fuel is harder to secure for private use. Taxes claim a share, labor cost more, public mood judges excess more harshly, regulation demands safety and accountability. The old machine cannot run privately at full scale without enormous strain. This is why many mansions did not survive at all. They did not have the location, the brand recognition, or the funding network to become public institutions. Some were demolished, others decayed into ruins. Their disappearance is part of the story too, because it shows that permanence was always a hope, not a guarantee. The mansions that remain have been reframed as culture. They are protected by a different kind of power, the power of public interest. They exist because communities, visitors, historians, and institutions find value in them. Their survival depends on collective attention rather than private fortune. This shift also closes the story's emotional arc. At the beginning, the mansion is built to separate and dominate. At the end, it survives only by opening itself and becoming shared. The private monument becomes a public space. The dream of exclusivity ends in public access. There is a final layer to this transformation. The mansion becomes safe again, but in a different form, As a private home, it was vulnerable to taxation, inheritance pressure, and family change. As a public institution, it gains stability through diversified income and cultural status. It can attract donors, it can justify grants, it can partner with governments and organizations. It can plan long-term because it is no longer tied to one family's fortune. Still, the mansion cannot escape the truth that it represents the last expression of a specific era. It is a relic of a time when private wealth believed it could create permanence through architecture. Modern billionaires do not repeat this, not because they lack money, but because the system no longer rewards that kind of permanence. So the mansion stands as both achievement and warning. It is achievement in craft, ambition, and coordination. It is warning in how quickly conditions can change, and how a building that seems eternal can become a burden when the rules shift. If you stand outside and look up at the towers, you can imagine the confidence that built them. You can imagine the belief that this would be a private world for generations, untouched. But you also know the ending now. The house is still here, but it is here because it surrendered its privacy. It exists as history, not as the future its builders intended. This is the final historical outcome. The monument era ended when wealth stopped trying to freeze itself in stone. It ended when the state learned to tax wealth systematically. It ended when labor became expensive and less available. It ended when public opinion turned visible excess into risk. It ended when flexibility became the new form of power. And this is why the richest people on earth, with fortunes beyond what the Gilded Age could imagine, do not build a new Biltmore. They do not need to. More importantly, they cannot justify the cost and exposure of doing so. Their wealth lives in movement, networks, and adaptability. The mansion belongs to a world that believed permanence could be purchased. The final image is not of collapse, but of transformation. The mansion stands with its doors open, its rooms preserved, its story packaged and shared. It is no longer a private kingdom. It is a public lesson. It is the last monument of an era that ended quietly, through math and law, and the realization that the biggest fortunes survive not by standing still, but by staying light enough to move.